Hi, Ezek with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us this week as we continue our Eastside Bible reading. This week, for the week of November 1 through 7, 2020, we're going to be beginning or continuing in Ezekiel chapter 16. And as we continue our reading in Ezekiel, God uses some very graphic yet appropriate language that accurately portrayed Israel's spiritual adultery. It's followed up by an emphasis of personal responsibility in another great chapter, chapter 18, which we covered, in fact, in one of our great chapters of the Bible studies. The people were complaining, apparently, that God was punishing them for the shortcomings of their ancestors, but Ezekiel says that's not so. And to illustrate, he tells the story of 3 generations of men, one righteous, then his son wicked, then his son righteous. And the point is summed up in verse 20, where God, through the prophet, says, the person who sins will die. Chapter 20, verse 1, gives us another date, 591 BC. And it proceeds with Israel's unfaithful history and gives us a wonderful promise of God for future restoration. The chapters that follow continue to outline the sins of Israel, again using graphic language in a story of 2 sisters who were meant to be Israel and Judah, who were insatiable in their lewdness. And that was so the people would understand why the consequences that they were experiencing were so severe. Ezekiel 25 begins a series of judgments on Israel's neighbors. God included judgments on Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, and a long 3-chapter from 26 through 28 judgment on Tyre. God accurately foretold of the destruction of that once great city, and it was a destruction from which it would never fully recover. In another dated section, in chapter 29, verse 1, which dates it to 587 BC, God begins a series of judgments against Egypt, who were themselves a once powerful nation, but were on the decline. It's important to realize what's going on here. Egypt was beaten by Babylon at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. But still, those who were living in Jerusalem were hoping that Egypt would deliver them from the Babylonian onslaught, from the Babylonian siege that they were experiencing just before they fell in 587 BC. God says to trust in Egypt is going to be a big mistake. Well, as we go over into our New Testament reading, our New Testament reading in John takes us through several fascinating events and times it to about a year before Jesus' death in John 6. John 6 contains the feeding of over 5,000 people. And as awesome as that was, Jesus declares himself to be food, to be the bread of life. And in a rare spark of understanding, Peter gets it. In John 6:68, when everyone else is leaving Jesus, Peter said, "To whom should we go? You have the words of life." Well, later on, Jesus attends the Feast of Booths and he declares himself there the source of living water. Chapter 8 has the touching story of Jesus extending grace to a woman who was caught in adultery while he convicts the hearts of her own accusers. Later in chapter 9, Jesus declared himself to be the light of the world and then proved it by bringing light to a blind man's darkness. And I want you to notice as you go through that chapter the progress of the man's understanding of Jesus in that fascinating chapter. There's a lot of controversy that followed Jesus, that surrounded him concerning that blind man's healing. And it continues over into chapter 10 where Jesus says he's the good shepherd, in contrast to the poor, inept leadership of the Jews at that time. As you read John chapter 10, take some time to compare what Jesus says concerning himself being the good shepherd to what God says in Ezekiel chapter 34, where God himself promised to shepherd his people. Well, there's no doubt that Jesus was already ruffling feathers, and the antagonism would just continue. In fact, it would only get worse. Thanks for joining us in this week's Eastside Bible reading. And I hope that you'll get the opportunity to read further. God bless you.